On the morning of June 15th, 1944, the Pacific Ocean turned red, and the men who survived that day would never forget the colour of the water near Saipan's beaches. 8,000 Marines hit the shoreline in the first 2 hours, and within minutes, the illusion of a swift, clean assault collapsed under a wall of Japanese artillery, mortar fire, and machine gun positions that had been meticulously prepared for exactly this moment. Saipan was not just another island on a map. It was a fortress, a prize, and a turning point in the entire Pacific War, and the Japanese High Command understood its value far better than most Allied planners were willing to admit. The island sits roughly 1,500 miles south of Tokyo, and American military strategists had identified it as the critical anchor for the Mariana Islands campaign, a drive that would place the brand new B-29 Superfortress bombers within operational range of the Japanese home islands for the first time in the war. If Saipan fell, the psychological and strategic architecture that Japan had constructed around its notion of an impenetrable defensive perimeter, the so-called absolute national defense sphere, would crack at its foundation. Japan's military leadership knew this with absolute clarity, which is precisely why Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito had positioned roughly 32,000 soldiers and naval troops across Saipan's rugged volcanic terrain and dense sugarcane fields in interlocking defensive networks designed to extract maximum casualties from any invading force. The American plan, designated Operation Forager, assigned the assault to the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions under the overall command of Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner and Lieutenant General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith, a Marine commander whose nickname was earned and whose reputation for demanding aggressive action under impossible conditions preceded him wherever the fleet sailed. The pre-invasion naval bombardment, which many commanders believed would soften Japanese defences to the point of near collapse, proved tragically inadequate. The island's defenders had buried themselves in caves, tunnels, and reinforced concrete positions that absorbed shellfire and emerged intact when the landing craft began their approach. The LVTs, landing vehicle tracked, the amphibious tractors carrying the first waves of Marines, crossed the reef and pushed toward the beaches designated green, red, blue, and yellow, and the Japanese opened fire with everything they had the moment the vehicles came within range, turning the approach into a killing ground. Marines who made it to the beach found that survival depended entirely on keeping moving, because to stop was to die, and the sugarcane that lined the inland approaches concealed Japanese soldiers who had orders to fight to the last man. By nightfall on June 15th, approximately 20,000 Americans had been put ashore at a cost of around 2,000 casualties, dead, wounded, and missing, in a single day, and General Saito, recognizing that his coastal defenses had not broken the assault, began preparing for a war of attrition in the island's interior that would stretch across 3 weeks of some of the most savage close-quarters fighting the Pacific theatre had yet produced. The terrain itself became a weapon. Saipan's central highlands, dominated by the 1,054-foot Mount Toppled, gave Japanese defenders commanding observation over almost every American movement, allowing artillery to be directed with precision onto marine positions that had no cover except the rocky earth they clawed into at night. The fighting through places like Death Valley and Purple Heart Ridge, names the Marines themselves gave to terrain features that would haunt their memories for decades, was relentless, intimate, and utterly brutal, with flamethrowers, grenades, and bayonets doing work that artillery could not finish. On June 19th, while the land battle raged, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a massive carrier-based air offensive intended to destroy the American fleet supporting the invasion, an engagement that became known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and which American aviators nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, because Japanese air power, decimated by years of attrition and outclassed by both American pilots and the new F-6F Hellcat fighters, suffered catastrophic losses of nearly 600 aircraft in 2 days, effectively ending Japan's carrier-based air power as a strategic instrument for the remainder of the war. Back on Saipan, the situation for Japanese civilians, approximately 25,000 men, women, and children, many of them Japanese settlers who had come to the island during decades of colonial administration, was deteriorating into tragedy. Imperial propaganda had told them for years that American soldiers were barbarians who would torture, rape, and murder any Japanese they captured, and 1,000 soldiers that achieved nothing except mass death, The civilian population began moving toward the island's northern cliffs in a desperate and doomed attempt to escape. What followed at Marpi Point became one of the most haunting episodes of the Pacific War. Hundreds of Japanese civilians, many of them families with children, chose to leap from the cliffs rather than surrender to American forces. Despite loudspeaker appeals from American ships and pleas from Nisei interpreters who begged them to believe that they would be treated humanely, American sailors watched helplessly as people fell, and the horror of those days left permanent marks on every man who witnessed it, forcing an entire generation of Americans to reckon with the question of what propaganda could do to the human mind when it was absolute and unchallenged. Saipan was declared secure on July 9, 1944, 24 days after the initial landing, at a cost of roughly 300 American dead and more than 13,000 wounded. And the Japanese garrison, true to its orders and its code, had been almost entirely annihilated, with fewer than 1,000 prisoners taken from a force that had numbered over 30,000. The fall of Saipan sent shockwaves through Tokyo that were immediate and severe. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and his entire cabinet resigned within days, a political earthquake that signaled to the world that Japan's leadership understood the war had entered its terminal phase. By November of 1944, just months after the island's capture, American engineers had constructed air bases on Saipan capable of launching B-29 Superfortresses on the 3,000-mile round trip to Japan, and the firebombing campaigns that would reduce much of Tokyo and dozens of other Japanese cities to ash began in earnest. Saipan was not the last battle, not the final sacrifice, but it was the moment the geography of the war changed permanently. The moment the Pacific Ocean stopped being Japan's moat and became America's highway, and the men who bled on those beaches and in those cane fields and on those ridgelines had purchased that highway with their lives, ensuring that a war which had begun in disaster at Pearl Harbor would end ultimately on terms that left no doubt about its outcome.